The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
KSQD thanks Sustainable Systems Research Foundation for supporting Sustainability Now. SSRF provides education, research, and advocacy for regional environmental quality and sustainability-related problems and solutions. For information, visit sustainablesystemsfoundation.org, and thank you, SSRF, for supporting community radio, K-Squid 90.7 FM.
Yes, good planets are hard to find. Hi, K-Squid listeners. It's every other Sunday again, and you're listening to Sustainability Now, a bi-weekly K-Squid radio show focused on environment, sustainability, and social justice in the Monterey Bay region, California, and the world. I'm your host, Ronnie Lipschutz. We live in a world of landscapes, whether they are in the middle of cities or out in the wilderness. And virtually all of these landscapes have been transformed by human action, whether in ancient times or just last week. We're now in the midst of what many scholars and pundits call the Anthropocene, and we're anticipating major impacts and disasters as a result of human-caused climate change. Yet few of us experience climate change as anything more than an abstraction, even in the midst of floods and hurricanes. Climate change is by and large experienced in local terms and not as vast atmospheric masses and oceanic rivers in motion, or secular global temperature changes over decades, or even the disappearance of familiar species such as birds and insects. So what does it mean to experience climate change locally, in local terms? My guest today, I hope, will answer some of those questions. He's Andrew Mathews, Chair and Associate Professor of Anthropology at UC Santa Cruz. He's just published Trees Are Shapeshifters: How Cultivation, Climate Change, and Disaster Create Landscapes, a closely documented study of trees and people in central Italy, and how they make sense of social and environmental change around them. Andrew Mathews, welcome to Sustainability Now.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
I read your book with great interest and found some echoes of stuff that I wrote 25 years ago in the book. So I was pleased on the one hand, and anyway, let's just go on. Okay, so perhaps the best way to begin is to have you give a brief summary of the book and how you decided to do research in central Italy around Pisa, Lucca, and Monte Pisano.
Yes, that's Monte Pisano.
Monte Pisano, okay.
Yes, great question. I partly grew up in Italy, and I knew I wanted to go back there to learn about it with a whole new set of eyes, which is one thing is to grow up in a place where your elders and neighbors tell you things, and another thing is to study it for yourself and learn again. But I was interested in Italian landscape because, like most Mediterranean landscapes, this is a place where people have been cultivating, shaping the landscape, transforming it for thousands of years. And I was interested in seeing what does it feel like to experience climate change in a place when you also have to remember all of this history of cultivation and landscape care, disasters in the past that have maybe reshaped the ecosystems, reshaped human cultivation systems. And sort of people there have this constant balance between the new ideas about climate change, but the older ideas about what it's like to live in a landscape where people used to be sort of peasant smallholders, and now they're all working in factories, and the landscape is falling into ruin.
Oh, well, the book is titled Trees Are Shapeshifters. Why did you choose that title?
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, because trees are shapeshifters, but you have to sort of attune yourself to the capacity of trees and plants to change form, right? Because they grow very slowly, but they respond to things like having branches cut off, being logged, fire and disease. And once you begin to appreciate the capacity of trees and plants to respond to the world, life becomes a lot more interesting. I could give examples of the shape-shifting capacities of trees on the UC Santa Cruz campus, right?
Yeah, that would be interesting, since our listeners presumably, know about redwoods, right?
Yeah, so redwoods are champion shapeshifters, right? So many of you have probably been up in the woods, different parts of pretty much anywhere in Santa Cruz County where we have redwoods. They were all logged in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then, they were cut off. They were just stumps. Often they burned the slash afterwards. The fires kind of left charcoal on all the stumps. And then this wonderful ecological sort of accident, nobody was planning for it, although presumably lots of people knew about it in some way. They resprouted from the stumps. And all of those redwood trees that you see when you walk in the woods around here resprouted from the stumps of trees that were logged during this crazy frontier period in the late 19th, early 20th century. And once your eyes get kind of clued in on that, all of a sudden you realize that these trees are changing shape all the time. And they can do something kind of miraculous. They can grow new branches. And unfortunately, if someone cuts my arm off, I cannot grow a new one, but a tree can, which is quite a trick.
Yeah, well, that's how you get fairy circles, right? Because of the sprouting of trees around the original stump.
That's right. The fairy rings.
Fairy rings, yeah.
Yes, same thing. And often you can see on some of the stumps the kind of the cuts where people built a platform so they could go up there and saw the tree down. So you can see the physical traces of that frontier period in front of your eyes everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Henry Cowell is kind of misleading, Henry Cowell Park, because there are original redwoods there, right? I don't know if it was logged or not, but one goes there and gets the impression that these have been there forever. And the same thing is true when students come to visit the campus. They have no sense that 100 years ago, 120 years ago, all of this place was clear cut. It's surprising. They're surprised when they hear it. Well, in the book, you argue that caring for tree form persuades humans to also care about landscape form, giving rise to a distinctive kind of politics. I'm kind of anticipating here some of our later discussion, but we certainly see politics around trees in the United States, but that idea of sort of original primordial forest, right, permeates the way that our politics of trees proceeds. What's the difference between the United States and Italy?
That's such a great question. So, there's many complexities, but a very good place to start is just that when they're in Italy, and I would say in the Mediterranean more broadly, just people are aware that this is a landscape that has been cared for by human beings kind of since forever, you could say. That's how people understand it. And so whenever there is a forest fire or a landslide or a flood, the immediate response is people need to take more care. In other words, humans need to do something in the landscape to make it safer, to restore it, to take care of it. And again, simplifying greatly, but in the United States and North America, the immediate assumption is, people need to get out of the landscape so that nature can do its thing. Right? So right. Putting people in versus taking people out, these are very different responses. And in some ways, I think Italy is a harbinger for where we're going to be at in North America also, because the landscapes that we live in North America are so profoundly transformed by human action that we can't imagine that just removing ourselves from the landscape is possible. So we're having to live now with the consequences of all the centuries of sort of land care and land abandonment and landscape abuse that we've done. And
as I'm thinking about it, the closest parallel is probably New England. But in New England, you have had all of these abandoned farms going back to forest, right? I mean, there are similarities there. But I don't know if you see the same kind of politics about New England forests that you describe in your book. And if you don't have an answer to that, that's fine. It's just an observation.
Yeah. I think that's a really good question, and I actually worked as a forester in New England. So
yeah, tell us about that too.
Somewhere in my mind, well, I'll just New England is sort of like Italy, which in the sense that when you walk through forest, you find all these stone walls and cellar holes, and you get a sense that this was an incredibly heavily humanized landscape. Vermont, where I worked, I don't have the numbers, but early in the 19th century, it was about 85 or 90% fields and pastures, and now it's just the opposite. It's about 90% forest. So that gives you a sense for how incredibly transformed the world is there. I would say one thing that is different in Italy from New England, and which actually resonates with California, is that it's a very unstable landscape. So like coastal California, they're recently uplifted marine sediments through tectonic action, basically sands and muds and shales and the like. And when forests are damaged or removed, you can get landslides. We also have earthquakes. So landscape stability in Italy is a directly practical question. There was landslides in Ischia outside Naples like yesterday.
Yeah, right.
And the first thing people said is, well, why did they cut the trees down and why didn't they fix the drainage? So they're saying, we need to take care of the landscape because it's unstable. We have to get involved in it. And that's New England's a pretty gentle place, and we don't have that particular problem there.
Yeah. How did you, you mentioned that you were trained as a forester. I thought that was kind of interesting. Tell us about that.
Yeah, actually the forester thing connects back to Italy. So when I, was an undergraduate, I was a physics major. I didn't know what I was going to do.
So was I.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, physics majors, they end up everywhere. So, after college, I was working in Italy, working as an agricultural laborer, and I was impressed and fascinated by the practical ecological knowledge of this generation of peasant farmers who are already quite elderly, but were still around. They were doing their thing. And I thought, okay, how can I learn about landscapes in something like the way that they understand trees and soils and plants? So I went back to school to study forestry. And that's how I got into it. It started with this idea that I would, learn how to take care of forests and come back to Italy. But I made a long detour by way of Mexico. But this project is my return to Italy. And
one of the things that turns up in the book is this local knowledge of the Italian peasants,
Yes.
the peasantry, which has died out, right? And of course, there's a lot of interest, especially in the academy, about indigenous and local knowledge. And later on in the book, you contrast that kind of applied practical experience with scientific forestry, and maybe you can compare the two. I mean, which is better? I mean, that's probably not the right term, but which works better?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And, people have been asking that question for the last 200 years, and we're not done asking it. But I will give you some things I've learned along the way. So, I was trained as a scientific forester. Foresters love tall, straight trees that you cut up into beams and, planks, basically. They can build cathedrals or ships out of the kinds of timbers that foresters know how to grow. And, peasants were interested in a lot of other things. They were interested in fruit trees that had horizontal branches. They were interested in firewood. They were interested in poles. They were interested in the fact that trees would stabilize canal banks. They would build terraces for them. So they were interested in many more things about trees than scientific foresters were. And they also developed a host of detailed, practical, place-based forms of knowledge, which more often don't translate to other places.
Right, yeah.
And I think it's the translatability of sort of scientific forestry, which is on the one hand allows you to go to a new landscape and think you know what you're doing, but on the other hand might lead you badly astray because you may well not know what you're doing.
Not to drop into lecture mode, but I did, this is now 30 years ago, when I wrote a book chapter on what was then called Redwood Summer. I don't know if you were around. This was a campaign modeled on Freedom Summer that took place up in Northern California and up the Pacific coast, trying to protect the redwoods. And what was really sort of interesting was thinking about how scientific forestry or industrial forestry, as it was taught, right, was very much about productivity, whereas you might say, ecological forestry, which was starting to become, which was being taught more and more in the universities, looked at biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. And the two were very much in, direct conflict. And to some degree, it seems like it's still the case, although the scientific foresters are gradually dying out, right? Because I don't know if that gets taught in universities anymore, that kind of industrial-focused forestry. But I could be wrong about that.
Well, we still have, around the world, we have sort of plantation forestry and industrial forestry. So I think it's more the case that it's retreated from what we call the wilder parts of the landscape, but there are industrial plantations are unfortunately expanding in many parts of the world.
Yeah, well, we need to take a short break, okay?
KSQD Santa Cruz 90.7 FM, KSQT Prunedale 89.7 FM, and translator K208GE Monterey 89.5 FM.
You're listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschitz, and my guest today is Dr. Andrew Mathews, professor of anthropology at UC Santa Cruz and chair of the department. And we're talking about his recently published book, Trees Are Shapeshifters. And we're sort of roaming back and forth amongst Italy and California and New England, and I guess the rest of the world, where plantation forestry is becoming it's also becoming a way to sequester carbon for a certain period of time, right? I mean, but we can come back to that. It's not really part of the conversation. Well, in your book, your focus is on chestnut trees. They're broad decline due to disease, and they're displaced by other tree species. So, I'm intrigued by the idea of chestnuts as a food source. Maybe tell us about that.
Yes. So, and I more or less stumbled across the chestnut in this landscape where I was working, which is the best kind of research when you come across it by accident. And so chestnut trees were the main source of carbohydrate food for people in Italy who are in the middle hills, I would say, sort of between, say, 208 or 900 meters in elevation. And it was part of this amazingly productive and complex system that linked chestnut trees with sheep and goats grazing in the woods, and they provided fuel. The animals provided, milk and cheese and butter and so on. And so it was a very integrated human, animal, plant system. It was greatly damaged in the late 19th century by diseases that were brought actually from East Asia, probably from China, with chestnut varieties were introduced from China, first to North America and then to Europe. And they gradually sort of eliminated big parts of the chestnut forest from the lower elevations. And all of this is happening at a time when the Italian government, as many other governments, was really interested in industrial agriculture and industrialization. So industrial agriculture in Italy meant wheat. So wheat cultivation was what governments cared about, and they saw chestnut cultivation as backward, insufficient, inadequate, lacking in nutrition. They had all kinds of rude stereotypes about people who lived off chestnut, as a staple. And so they didn't really care too much about the damage caused by the disease. And when chestnut cultivation went away, they just said, well, that's progress for you. And again, there was a second disease that came through in the late 30s, also from sort of introduced from East Asian chestnut varieties. And again, that seemed to be the final death knell of the population. So chestnut cultivation is interesting because they're grafted trees, which means you combine a cultivated variety with a wild rootstock, and they can live for centuries, but only if people keep on taking care of them. So in many places in the landscape, you'll have cultivated chestnut trees that are 300, 400, 500, 600 years old that have required more or less continual human care over these many centuries. If someone doesn't come by every decade or so and kind of cut off the shoots that emerge from what we call the lower part, the rootstock, it'll fall apart. So it's a very inspiring example in a world where people do everything in the short term of, in some places at some times, humans manage to keep things going for decades and centuries. It's a good example for us. And, in North America, the oldest old-growth trees are sort of trees which appear not to have much connection with humans. And in the Mediterranean, chestnuts aren't necessarily the oldest trees, but they're getting up there. And those are trees which, if you find them anywhere, they're there because humans cared about them and planted them and have continued to care for them.
But given the two diseases that ran through the chestnut groves, why are there still surviving trees?
Luck is one factor, but elevation is another, right? The diseases that do the most damage are happier at lower elevations. So the places where the chestnut has survived is sort of higher up where it's cooler. And in fact, now with climate change, of course, the disease is pushing uphill.
That's interesting.
The other part that I was forgetting, which is that the second disease is chestnut canker. This is the disease that wiped out the North American chestnut in the early 20th century. And so this is in like the 1910s or so that it arrives in Pennsylvania, and it's a disaster, and there are governmental commissions, and of course there's nothing they can do. And this species, which formerly was a huge component of eastern forests, just basically disappeared within a period of 20 years or so. And then that same disease arrived in Italy and in the Mediterranean in the late 1930s. And people had been watching North America, and they thought, this is the end of the world. The same exact thing that happened in Pennsylvania or Connecticut is going to happen here. And at first, that seemed to be what was happening. The trees were dying in the space of a year or two, and that was it. But then this sort of ecological miracle happened, which is that the chestnut canker itself acquired a disease which slowed it down. And that largely halted it, and that's why chestnut in Mediterranean didn't disappear.
That's interesting. Of course, the chestnuts in North America weren't cultivated, right? Or were they? I mean, this is something that nobody would know about, as food.
Well, I think that indigenous people and other people in North America did eat chestnuts, and it seems likely they didn't graft them, so they didn't have that kind of more intense form of cultivation, but it's quite likely that there was some landscape care practices which would have favored a species that produced food both for humans and for wildlife, right?
Yeah.
It's not well understood to my knowledge, but I would say that given what we know about indigenous land care practices, I would be astonished if they were not observing and sort of caring for these species.
But you did meet up with some of these Italian peasants, right? I mean, they were quite old, according to what you wrote in the book. And one of the things I remember now, 30 years ago, hearing someone, it might have been Margaret Fitzsimmons or someone else, talk about the many meanings of the forest. That for a forester, it's lumber. For someone who is interested in recreation, it's the outdoors. And I'm curious, did you get a sense from these peasants of the meanings, cultural meanings that were imputed to these chestnut groves? And I asked this question, right, because, and it's something that talked about on previous shows, right, is about that we tend to look at nature in terms of value, in terms of particularly economic value, right, as opposed to cultural value or cultural meaning, because I don't like, the idea of value. And I'm wondering, did you get from the peasants, these old peasants, any ideas of how they, sort of their social relationship to the forest?
That's a really good question. So, they're very interested in working in the chestnut trees, but also olive trees. So there's this practical working with plants is just fascinating to them. They're committed to keeping them going, right? So there's a sense that a sense of obligation to keep it going, a sense of responsibility, also very intensely judgmental about their neighbors who don't take care of trees in just the way that they would. So, if you ever wondered what three old farmers are doing sitting at a cafe somewhere in Italy, they're probably gossiping about their neighbors' cultivation practices and basically arguing that the way they do it is better, right? So, but it's practical, it's aesthetic, and there's a sense of obligation. There's also judgment, all of those things.
It's a lot like raising children, I guess, in that respect, right? There are dozens of ways, and no one can agree on what is the best.
But in the case of trees, your neighbors walk by and look at your trees and say, "Oh, Andrew doesn't know what he's doing."
Yeah. One of the things you talked about that really struck me is this idea of forest cleaning, the raking up of leaves and litter to reduce the risk of fire, make compost, the coppicing of trees and shoots. Probably should say what that means.
Yep.
To control tree shape and growth, and the system of terraces and drainage to direct water and avoid mudslides. And I mean, all of this resonates with debates here in California about overgrown forests. And so how did this system of forest care develop?
Yeah, so I would say since the Roman times, since the Middle Ages, this has been a landscape that is just full of people, right? Requiring continual work to keep it going. And as human populations increase in the Middle Ages, that becomes even more the case. So the kinds of things people did, I would say every growing thing had a purpose and someone who's responsible for keeping it going. So firewood would be cut, and coppicing is the way they would cut firewood. This takes advantage of this capacity of trees to resprout from the stump. So you might get like a dozen or 15 shoots, and then gradually that's reduced to 4 or 5. And after 15 years, you come back and you cut it again. And so firewood all across Europe has been produced for many, many centuries off the same stumps. This is called coppicing. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the ways in which people sort of continually worked with trees to get things they needed, sometimes firewood, sometimes poles. Litter raking is just another aspect of this. So it's well known for Central Europe, not well known for Italy, but it turns out to be ubiquitous. So basically people would go out in the woods, they would pick up certainly every scrap of firewood on the ground, but another practice was to rake up the leaf litter either with these sort of wooden claws. They would just rake it up, put it in baskets or in bundles and carry it down to the farm. They would mix that with animal manure from the stables, from the stalls. They would compost it, and then that was their source of fertilizer. So in that world, forests and agriculture were tightly linked. Forests were a source of nutrients, and you really couldn't keep olive cultivation going without the support of sheep, goats, and forests and litter raking. And at least for the generation that I talk to, really quite elderly people now in their 70s, 80s, even 90s, most of that work was done by women and children. Mm-hmm. It's hard to say what it was like 100 or 200 years ago, but it's quite likely that that was also the case then. So imagine a world in which the forest looked really different from here, where literally every scrap of vegetable material that fell on the forest floor was gathered and had a purpose and someone who's responsible for it. And that produced a landscape which was very much less likely to burn, because as my informants, as the people I talked to told me, they said, how could it burn? If a flame started, someone would put it out and it had nowhere to go. There was nothing to burn. Mm-hmm. This is very different from now, and this is much more similar to what we have here in Santa Cruz in California, where the forest is full of dry vegetation, and as we know, we can have catastrophic fires.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's take another break.
KSQD Santa Cruz 90.7 FM, KSQT Prunedale 89.7 FM, and translator K208GE Monterey 89.5 FM.
You are listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschitz, and my guest today is Professor Andrew Mathews, who is in the Anthropology Department at UC Santa Cruz, and we're talking about his newly published book, Trees Are Shapeshifters. And we were just talking about cleaning the forest floor, which of course is a topic that comes up repeatedly in California between those who argue that we need to, tidy up the forests so that forest fires aren't intense, and those who argue for leaving it as it is in the interest of ecosystemic processes. But let's go on, right? So in the 19th century, industrialization and state building appear, right, in the modern sense. And you bring in the book not just industrialization, but political economy as well, a changing political economy, as critical factors and forces, transforming this landscape, right, and what people were doing in the landscape. So how did that, what did this do to chestnut cultivation, and how did people respond to it?
Yeah, so people had been leaving the mountains in Italy already since the mid-19th century. I would say the peak population and industry in mountains really right across the Mediterranean world was sometime like in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So at that time, in rural places, there was lots of industry. So something that happens, the system shifts in the late 19th century, and all of that rural industry kind of goes away, and it gets concentrated down in the valleys in large cities. So this is really hard for us to imagine, right? We think of the mountains as being kind of remote, close to nature, and yet at that time, for much of the last 1500 years, mountains and middle hills were where industry was, because there was water power. You could get work done. Mm-hmm. So imagine lots of small factories, a shoe factory, a small little shoemaker, a paper mill, these kinds of things. They just all go away. And people have to leave, and they move down to big cities. They move to Pisa, they move to Milan, they move to Brazil, they move to New York, right? That's the where people begin to leave cultivation and enter the industrial labor force. In Italy, it really takes hold after World War II, in a period of 10 or maybe that's the last blow of that system, when Italy begins to have very rapid industrialization. In the Monte Pisano, people go and get works making scooters. The
Vespas.
Vespas, yes. There was a Vespa factory like 15 miles away, and that was a great job. And people left and did that, and very, very rapidly. And then all of this landscape gets abandoned. The forest grows very rapidly. People no longer need it for fuel, no longer doing litter raking. And within 15 or 20 years, you begin to have very large and dangerous wildfires.
I mean, it's very characteristic, right, of rural and agricultural areas around the world that when particularly state and capital, seek to expand, right, people living in the more remote places find that they can no longer make a living, right, and they migrate to cities. I mean, it's happened here. It's happened, it's everywhere, and what's left behind. And of course, in the mountains, I suppose it's much more difficult to come up with large scale industrial replacements for what's been going on there, because the landscape is so variegated. Let's turn to climate change, because we've been having shows on climate change. Everybody's been sort of going nuts because of the conference in Egypt, which was the topic of our last show. The basic argument that you make, as I understand it, is that climate change, as we sort of generally talk about it, is too abstract and distant to motivate people to action, and that scientific models and predictions seek precision in an area of social life that is characterized by messiness. And did I get that right?
Yes, you put it very well. I mean, climate is a strange term, right?
Yeah,
climate really is an average of weather over some period of time and over some area. So we could say Santa Cruz has climate if we mean, well, over a period of 10 or 20 or 30 years, these are the temperatures, this is the rainfall, this is kind of what we might expect. So it's a mathematical construct in the way that scientists use it. And like mathematical constructs, like gross national product, it's hard to get excited about it. So when was the last time, you felt really deeply, personally, intimately concerned with the United States gross national product? And it's not really until someone tells you that, the budget of your employer is being cut or something, that's when that's
really
when the
feel it.
rubber hits the road. And climate change is kind of like that. It's like, it's only when climate change causes sort of environmental or social consequences in the world as you experience it that you really begin to get concerned. And actually, Santa Cruz is a great example. Until we had the lightning complex CZU fire, I feel like lots of people felt climate change was somewhat more abstract than after the fire. I noticed people becoming, including myself, being much more passionately concerned about it. In Italy, the analog for that would be not actually so much fires, although they're a problem too, but it's floods and landslides. So people in Italy feel really concerned about sort of floods and landslides, and also with droughts. And those are the ways, those are the experiences of life which make them care about climate change and demand that something be done about it.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I was just... and then, what would have... Are there vernacular models of weather and climate? I mean, because, again, as you talk about this, right, I mean, the CZU complex fire was an immediate event in those of us, living here, and much more so people living in the mountains, right? And the sort of the models, right, seek to draw curves and lines, which, again, are argued to have certain precision, even though they're, they don't give predictability for specific places, right? And yet there's a sense of, this is how we control this, right? By understanding the statistics, the lines and the curves. And yet the local sort of manifestation is quite different. So, I mean, I'm talking a lot here, but this idea, are there vernacular models? I mean,
yes.
Do you think?
Yes, so that's vernacular, just it's a word for, ordinary people's ways of talking about climate, right? And of course, and this surprises my students, but we are all climate experts.
Sure.
Because when we go outside and we say, this is odd, it's unusually rainy today, we have a model in our head of what an ordinary kind of day should be, and we decide whether today is weird or normal or interesting or whatever. So that's what you might call a vernacular, popular model of climate. So one of the problems with climate change policy, right, is that the scientific version of climate is only one kind of climate. There's also a more popular version of climate, and I think scientists and policymakers don't realize that there's more than one version of climate out there. And therefore, they see their task as one of persuading everyone to see it their way, when really it's a case of collaborating across many different ways of thinking about climate.
In a way, just, parenthetically, it's almost a reflection of the crisis of, you might call it crisis of science, right? That the control over phenomena, physical phenomena that was promised, or that seemed to emerge out of the technologies of the mid-20th century, right, have not materialized to a significant degree. I mean, the big technologies, right? You think of nuclear power, or even weather modification, and so there's this whole idea of scientific skepticism is not just simply I don't believe, but it's also skepticism about just how predictable things might be, That and again, right? The key here is to try and predict the future. Economists try to do that too. They're not so good at it, but again, it's sort of that reflection of that. If we can only draw these lines and predict the future, we can also control it.
Yeah, actually, this is a really nice example because one of the effects of the climate crisis is that we think intensely about climate change. But we actually also have to think about other environmental disasters because they're sort of, in particular places, equally important or at least worthy of thinking about. And really nice example of what happens when you get focused on one set of numbers to the detriment of the world is, logging off the redwoods in Santa Cruz in the 1890s. There was a boom time economy and people said, wow, we're going to get rich quickly. Let's just cut them down. And measuring trees in terms of board feet made sense for that brief period, and we're living in the ruins of that experiment, right? In Italy in the 1950s, people thought chestnut was going to disappear, and they logged those trees and turned them into tannin for making, fancy handbags and shoes. So whenever we're faced with an environmental crisis, we tend to get kind of overly focused on that crisis and the solutions to it, and understanding more of the history of our landscape gives us a little bit of a distance on it. So, the next time someone says, let's dedicate all forests to one purpose, you might be able to say, well, last time we tried that in Santa Cruz in 1890, it didn't work out so well. And so that monomaniacal focus on one problem and one purpose needs to be tempered by understanding sort of examples from the past that kind of teach us to be a little bit more skeptical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one of the sections of your book is entitled Ecological Modeling as Empirical Storytelling. And, that's a really interesting sort of, argument heading. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a story about what that means.
Sure. Well, I might get a little technical here, and you'll have to flag me down if I go there.
I'll do that.
So when we see climate models, we see what look like very sort of confident predictions. But climate models and ecological models in general always rely upon, simplifications, right?
Yeah.
You have to decide which aspects of this very complex ecosystem are to be measured, which processes are going to be modeled, and then you extrapolate forward. So, it's not so much that you're predicting in this sort of straightforward, this happens, therefore that happens. It's much more the case that you set out your assumptions and then you extrapolate them forward. So think of that as being a kind of, it is a kind of storytelling, but it's empirical because you have to be responsible. You have to measure things. You have to figure out whether you're going to count the number of trees or measure how quickly they're respiring and so on. So it is absolutely empirical, but it also requires you to extrapolate, and it becomes, principled estimation and in some ways guesswork.
Bruno Latour wrote about this in his book Laboratory Life back in the late 1970s about how scientists have to make judgments and how they work with black boxes, things that produce outputs, but which they don't know exactly what's going on inside of it. And so the whole sort of enterprise, right, is not just about assumptions, it's also about judgments, experience, and peer pressure. I mean, that's what peer review is basically about, right? So a process that's presented as very meticulous and data-driven is actually also a social process and quite messy. And but if you confront, from experience, I know if you confront scientists with this kind of proposition, they often get very alarmed and huffy, right? Because they think you're saying, well, it's not science, it's something else. Now, you're an anthropologist. Actually, let's take a break before we come back to this, and we'll get to the last part of the show.
KSQD Santa Cruz 90.7 FM, KSQT Prunedale 89.7 FM, and translator K208GE Monterey 89.5 FM.
And you're listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschitz, and my guest today is Professor Andrew Mathews of the UCSC Anthropology Department, and we've been talking about trees, and particularly about his recently published book, Trees Are Shapeshifters. Well, you're an anthropologist. Reminds me of that the Smothers Brothers song. My old man is an anthropologist. And anthropologists focus on local life, nature, and culture. And my experience is they find it difficult to generalize from their specific case studies. And so I'm wondering if you can generalize, broadly speaking. I mean, we have been talking about California and other parts of the world. But what can you extract from your research, particularly around this idea of citizen opposition, that might be something that you could, generalize to other parts of the world? I mean, you sort of present the struggles over the Tuscan forests as, a particular example of forest politics. But what does it have, what insights can it shed on forest politics elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think that anthropologists, we went through a period when we basically always said, my place, my local place is different from every other place to some degree. But I think that I would like us, and I think many of us do think that we can, the stories that we learn from paying attention to, peasants or indigenous people or scientists in laboratories, they can travel. They can inspire you to understand the world differently in other places too. And I think that the example that I give from Italy is really how people draw on their experience of, landscape abandonment. They saw what happened when people went to the cities. They saw the effects of pollution when tannin factories polluted the air, and that led them to sort of push back against it and to say, no, we don't want it, right? So people can draw upon their landscape to inspire a kind of environmental politics which is attentive to their particular needs, and I think that's a story that travels. I hope it does, right? I see a lot of more specific similarities actually between California and Italy to do with sort of forests and geology and soils, but that's another matter. But I think that, the kind of storytelling that anthropologists engage in can provide us examples that can inspire us to do things differently in other places too.
But I mean, you see this example as being about politics, right? About forest politics. It's not. I mean, we always look at these things in terms of production, right, and political economy and value, and yet they're political. And so my question is, do you regard the political struggle going on over these forests? Who is winning? Let me put it that way: who is winning, and what can you provide any advice to these sorts of movements in other places? That's really what I wanted to try and get at.
Yes, I would say that the landscapes you live in are full of stories and full of history, and they're a resource for dealing with contemporary politics. In lots of parts of the world, actually specifically with relation to climate change, the promise of governments and states around the world of how are we going to deal with climate change, one of the big parts of it has been, yes, we're going to get energy from biomass by cutting down forests and burning them and getting electricity from that, right? And there are lots of things wrong with that. Part of that is that it's kind of crazy when you hitch the world energy system just to forests and therefore don't deal with where energy is coming from, which is fossil fuels that you're pulling out of the ground. So you're hitching a small part of the energy system to forests and then destroying forests. So we can draw upon our daily life, the world that surrounds us, to inspire our own political demands and our own resistances to basically bad ideas that are coming down the turnpike. Specific example, I think, would be in Santa Cruz. We are so lucky that redwoods are holding those hillsides together, because if they weren't, we would have a lot more landslides. So we should be grateful to them, and we should be very skeptical about sort of projects that say biomass energy is going to be the most important thing to do with forests.
Well, redwoods, of course, don't provide the kind of growth,
yes,
right, that provides that sort of the ability to harvest selectively for forests. I mean, the Tuscan, the idea here is behind the biomass projects in the Italian mountains, right, is that these are, what's the right word? These are sort of classical trees, right? They don't grow tall and straight. They grow all over the place, right? And there's this notion that there's some kind of surplus growth in these forests, right? And if they're carefully harvested, you can keep on growing, and of course it's renewable, right? I mean, it's zero emission. That's the term, right? Is that you sequester the carbon in the trees, you cut off the branches grow back, sucking carbon out of the air, and so there's this kind of net zero proposition, right? Which is which you can't really talk about redwoods in that way, because nobody is cutting them down you can't coppice them because they're so tall.
Well, I think we're lucky that we're not coppicing them, but you actually could, because weirdly they do. And that's exactly what happened here when we had logging in the 19th century. The only reason we have redwoods now is they coppiced. They grew back from the stump. Luckily, no one's proposing, as far as I know, to convert redwood forests to biomass, to wood chips. But biomass projects are big in further inland in California. For much the same sets of reasons, right? It's supposed to be carbon neutral energy. It's supposed to deal with diseased forests where you want to eliminate trees.
Right, yeah.
And, it's potentially very problematic. Let's leave it with in Italy it turns out that you can't produce enough wood chips to power the energy system, so they're busy importing wood chips from Eastern Europe and probably from the Ukraine too. You have timber mafias importing wood chips with all kinds of sort of violence and corruption.
Yeah, well, that's a kind of a bizarre outcome, right? That you argue on the basis of these abstract calculations that there is enough to power these projects, and then you discover that no, it doesn't work that way, and we have to go somewhere else to get it. The last thing that I have here on my list is this idea of that the political struggle is underway in these forests between those who regard forests as underutilized resources and those who take cultural positions on them. You talked about that. Who are these culturalists? I thought that was a sort of an interesting term. Do you remember it?
One thing, actually, this is a very Italian story, but I think it might have some kind of echo with this, which is that there's sort of an aesthetic attraction to holding the landscape fixed, making it beautiful, and the sort of cultural tourist institutions in Italy have basically made it very hard to continue working in the landscape. So rural people find this very threatening. So it's something like this. It goes, well, you mustn't touch that tree because it's beautiful. And rural people say, it's beautiful because my grandfather took care of it, and my father took care of it, and I propose to take care of it also. So there is kind of culture as a set of practices and culture as a set of ideas about holding things fixed. And that, of course, is very different from the United States. I think probably we should hang on to culture as a set of practices as well as ideas, and that might make it work better.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the United States, it's this idea of the primordial forest, right? The forest before the arrival of Europeans. That these were a place that were in balance, and self-regenerating. Although there was a lot of care going into many of them, right? But I think, is that the sense of what goes on in Italy? Is people are not looking at landscapes in terms of originary conditions, I suppose, since that's thousands of years in the past.
Yes, that's right, and I would say that's the big difference, and maybe the big lesson that Italy has to offer us. It's just that, in Italy, it's basically very difficult, or I wouldn't say impossible, but very difficult ever to say, this is pure nature, don't touch it because human beings should stay out. And, of course, there are places that just people should retreat from and not do things in. But nevertheless, we're now in a world that is so profoundly transformed by human action that even withdrawing is a form of human action. So, we need to be involved in and care for landscapes. Certainly, indigenous folks in California have been caring for their landscapes forever, and of course they want to do more of that, and that's something that is admirable, and we should both respect and support and learn from. And I think that kind of the idea that humans are responsible for and are able to, if they pay attention, are respectful enough to make landscapes kind of work better, is something we're just going to have to be living with, because with climate change and with disease epidemics and the like, there's no option.
Well, we're at the end of the show, and I want to thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful conversation and for being my guest on Sustainability Now.
Thank you. It's just been a great pleasure, and I've really enjoyed your questions, and I'll be thinking about them as I go out.
So the title of the book is Trees Are Shapeshifters, How Cultivation, Climate Change, and Disaster Create Landscapes, and it's published this year by Yale University Press. What do you know about CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, passed in 1970 and signed into law by then-Governor Ronald Reagan? For more than 50 years, CEQA has been used to inform decision makers and the public about the potential environmental impacts of proposed projects. In recent years, however, it has been applied in situations for which it was not designed, especially new housing developments. In response, both Governor Newsom and the state legislature are seeking to amend the law to prevent various activists and opponents from obstructing new housing. Not so fast, say the law supporters. They point to a recent report by the Rose Foundation that finds that CEQA has had little, if any, impact on housing projects across the state. So who is correct? In 2 weeks, my guest on Sustainability Now will be Professor Deborah Sivas of the Stanford Law School, who teaches environmental law, directs the Environmental Law Clinic at Stanford, and has represented various environmental organizations in the courts. We'll talk about CEQA and whether it is really standing in the way of more housing in California. That's on Sunday, September 17th from 5 to 6 p.m. on Community Radio for the Monterey Bay region, KSQD 90.7 FM in Santa Cruz, KSQT 89.7 FM in Prunedale, Translator K27FE FX for Monterey at 89.5 FM, and of course ksqd.org streaming on the internet. If you'd like to listen to previous shows, you can find them at ksquid.org/sustainabilitynow, as well as Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Pocket Casts, among other podcast sites. So thanks for listening, and thanks to all the staff and volunteers who make KSquid your community radio station and keep it going. And so, until next every other Sunday, Sustainability Now.